Speaker, Canadians should be able...
Mr. Speaker, the record is...
Mr. Speaker, he goofed. He stood on the floor of the House of Commons.
Mr. Speaker, housing rental affordability continues to improve.
There is a number that directly affects every single person watching this video right now. Not a political number, not a parliamentary procedure, a grocery number. The average Canadian household spent $16,288 on food in 2024, up from $12,400 in 2019. That is a $3,888 increase in 5 years on something you can't stop buying this week in the House of Commons. Two men argued about whose fault that is. One of them presented data, one of them presented emotion. And here is the thing. Both of them were right about something, and both of them were hiding something. That is what nobody's covering. That is what we're doing today before I show you what each side got right and what each side deliberately left out. Tell me in the comments, when you go grocery shopping right now, are you spending noticeably more than 2 years ago? Just yes or no. I want to see what the real number looks like in this audience. Poilievre opened with this.
Speaker, Canadians should be able to fill their grocery carts without emptying their bank accounts. But yesterday, we learned that for the 4th month in a row, Canada had the highest food price inflation in the G7 under this Liberal Prime Minister. All the other G7 countries have the same tariffs and wars and other global factors as we do, but it is under this Prime Minister that Canadians are paying the most, the fastest. Yet,
okay, let's examine that claim properly. Is Canada's food inflation the highest in the G7 for specific months in late 2024? Yes, that is documented. But here is what highest food inflation in the G7 doesn't tell you. One, food inflation and overall inflation are different measurements. Canada's overall CPI has been running at roughly 2.8 to 3.1%, which is actually below the G7 average during the same period. Germany hit 5.4%. The UK peaked above 10% in 2023. Italy is still managing energy-driven price spikes. 2. The G7 comparison ignores the composition of Canadian food imports. Canada imports roughly 40% of its fresh produce, primarily from the United States. When Trump imposed tariffs on Canadian goods, Canadian retaliatory tariffs on American food products raised the cost of imported items Canadians rely on daily. That is not a Liberal government failure. That is a direct consequence of a bilateral trade war. 3, and this is the number Poilievre never said once in that entire exchange: Canadian average wages. Not mentioned, not once. And that is not an accident. Carney came back with this.
Mr. Speaker, the record is that every month that I've been Prime Minister, Canadian average wages have grown faster than the rate of inflation. Every month I've been Prime Minister, rents have fallen relative to wages. And you know what? There's more good news, Mr. Speaker, because on June 5th, over 12 million Canadians are going to receive the Groceries and Essentials Benefit Top-Up. A boost today and a bridge to tomorrow.
Now here is the data behind that claim. Statistics Canada's Labour Force Survey shows average hourly wages increased 4.9% year over year through Q1 2025. Headline inflation over the same period ran at approximately 2.8 to 3.1%. That means real wages after inflation, increased by roughly 1.7 to 2.1%. That is verifiable. That is not spin. But here is where I want to push back on Carney too. Because wages growing faster than inflation is an aggregate number. It includes executives, professionals, and government workers. If you strip out the top income quintile, the picture for median and lower income households looks materially different. The single mother Poilievre keeps referencing, she probably isn't seeing 4.9% wage growth. She is likely seeing 2 to 3% if she is in retail or food service, which means she is roughly breaking even with inflation, not ahead of it. Both men are using real data selectively. Neither is telling the full story. Let that sink in. Poilievre hit the rent issue hard in the second exchange.
Mr. Speaker, he goofed. He stood on the floor of the House of Commons and claimed that it is now more affordable than at any time in a decade. The seniors who have to line up at food banks after those food bank lineups have doubled. No, he's wrong. The young people who are paying twice the rent that they would have paid a decade ago know he's wrong. The single mother who's paying 40% more for groceries and has to turn back items at the grocery checkout know he's wrong. Will he just stand up, admit he's human, that he made a mistake, that he goofed up, and that he got it wrong on affordability?
Carney's response.
Mr. Speaker, housing rental affordability continues to improve. Asking rents have declined for 18 consecutive months. Every single month that this government has been in office, Canadian average salaries have increased. And now the IMF says that Canada will be the second strongest economy in the G7 this year and next. We are growing Canada strong. Thank you very much.
Okay, so who is right on rent? Here is the honest answer. Both of them are correct about different time periods. The decade comparison, Poilievre wins. Average one-bedroom rent in Toronto went from approximately $1,100 in 2015 to over $2,200 in 2024. That is real. That is documented. Young Canadians trying to enter the rental market today face a fundamentally different cost structure than their parents did. The 18-month trend. Carney wins. Asking rents peaked in mid-2023 and have declined year over year for 18 consecutive months. Zumper's Canadian National Rent Report confirms this. The trajectory has improved, but here is the catch neither man mentioned. The reason rents stopped climbing isn't primarily government policy. It is that immigration intake slowed, new supply started hitting certain markets, and demand pressure moderated organically. Neither the government's housing policy nor Carney's programs drove that correction. Markets moved, which means the correction could reverse just as quickly. Now here is the section nobody's covering. And honestly, this is the part that gets under my skin more than most parliamentary debates I've analyzed. Both leaders spent an entire question period arguing about symptoms. Neither one discussed the cause. The Canadian housing affordability crisis didn't start in 2021. It didn't start with this Liberal government. It didn't start with the previous Conservative government. It started in 2008. After the financial crisis, the Bank of Canada dropped interest rates to near zero and held them there for over a decade. That cheap money flooded into the one asset class that Canadians trust most, real estate. Between 2008 and 2022, average Canadian home prices increased 220%. Who benefited? Homeowners, particularly in Ontario and BC, particularly people who bought before 2010. Who lost? Anyone who didn't own property. Young Canadians, new immigrants, lower income families. The exact people both politicians claim to be fighting for. Now add the corporate angle. Between 2016 and 2022, real estate investment trusts, REITs, acquired roughly 200,000 Canadian rental units, converting them from affordable long-term housing to maximized yield short-term assets. Rents on REIT-held properties rose an average of 26% faster than rents on privately held units over the same period. Nobody in that House of Commons exchange mentioned REITs. Nobody mentioned a decade of near-zero interest rates. Nobody mentioned the financial mechanics that actually created the crisis. Because the politicians who benefit from homeowner voters don't want to tell homeowners that their financial prosperity came at the direct expense of younger Canadians. That is the real story, and it is not partisan. It predates every government currently in that building. Poilievre kept referencing a single mother turning back items at the grocery checkout. Let me take that seriously for a second. Not as a political prop, but as a human reality. In 2024, Food Banks Canada reported a record 2.1 million monthly visits to food banks across the country. 2 million visits. In a country of 40 million people, that is not an abstraction. Those are real people. Working people, in many cases, who cannot get through a month on what they earn. The grandmother choosing between heating and eating, the single parent skipping meals so her kids don't have to, the young man who moved back home at 28 because rent took 60% of his income. These people deserve better than being used as props in a parliamentary point-scoring exercise. And both leaders used them that way this week. The human cost is real, and neither man is engaging with it honestly. Okay, here is the framework you actually need. Screenshot this or save this video. These 3 data points will tell you definitively who is right by December 2025. Data point 1. Real wage growth for bottom 2 quintiles, not average wages, not aggregate wages. The bottom 40% of earners. If their real wages are rising, Carney's narrative holds. If they're flat or declining, Poilievre's narrative holds. Statistics Canada releases this quarterly. Watch Q2 and Q3 2025. Data point 2. Food bank visits. If monthly food bank visits decline from the 2.1 million peak, that is evidence affordability is genuinely improving at the household level. If they continue rising, the aggregate economic data is masking real distress at the bottom. Data point 3. Rental vacancy rates. If rental vacancy rates rise above 3% nationally, downward pressure on rents will continue, and Carney's 18-month decline trend extends. If vacancy rates tighten, rents reverse, and Poilievre's narrative gains traction again. These 3 numbers won't lie. Politicians will. The data won't. Now, here is the question I want you to think about before my prediction. If both Carney and Poilievre are using real data selectively, and if the actual cause of the affordability crisis predates both of them, what does that tell you about what kind of political leader Canada actually needs right now? Drop your honest answer below. I'll read everyone here as my prediction, on record. By October 2025, if real wages continue growing at roughly 45 to 5% annually and food inflation moderates below 3%, Carney's framing will be vindicated by the data, and Poilievre will be forced to shift his attack from affordability to something else. Watch for a pivot toward housing supply or immigration in his question period strategy. If food inflation spikes again above 5%, driven by a second wave of tariff impacts on American imports, Poilievre's narrative dominates through the fall, and Carney's growing Canada strong messaging becomes politically untenable. The tariff situation with the United States is the wild card. Nobody's pricing into this domestic affordability debate. And that is where the real risk lives. Rhetoric fades, data compounds.